want to welcome you again to another episode of Prodigy Search Presents. I've been fortunate to do probably a dozen or more of these since we started back in April, but I got, with all due respect to the dozen or so people we've had before, this one I'm looking forward to the most. Fun and introduced to you Andrew Bernstein. Andy, I don't know if you go by Andrew informally, but clearly your business, your success is under Andrew Bernstein. But Andy, welcome to our Prodigy Search Presents. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Scott, it's amazing to connect with you, my friend. You can call me Andy, Andrew, whatever you want to call me, man, because we've known each other. You're probably one of the longest. I don't want to say oldest because I hate using old at our age, right? But the longest friendship in business, longest collaboration, whatever you want to call it. We've known each other, I think, since the beginning of my career, which is coming up to 40 years. Next month is 40 years I've been in business.
Well, I'll get to that in a minute because I want to give you an appropriate introduction for those that don't know Andy. Among many accolades, it may be high on your list. In 2018, Andy was named as a Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame Curt Gowdy Award, I think is what it referred to, Andy. But what an amazing honor to be in the Basketball Hall of Fame. That was in 2018. As you mentioned, 40 years. I believe it was the NBA's official photographer. Started back in 80, 81, 82. We'll talk about in a minute. As Andy pointed out, I was fortunate to meet, I think back in, might have been 82 or 83 in Josh Rosenfeld's office or somewhere around that. Josh at the time was a PR director for the Lakers, but I had gone over to the Clippers in 84. And Andy, I think we formally brought you in as a team photographer then. And I don't want to say the rest is history because you made the history, I didn't, but and then brought you to the Kings in 88, and you've done, you either currently are or have been the official photographer for the Lakers, the Kings, the Clippers, the Dodgers, on and on and on and on. You've written a couple books, collaborated with Kobe Bryant. I want to talk about that in a little bit, and with Phil Jackson. Very impressive credentials. And I'm sure I'm missing a lot. And is there anything else we should highlight before we get into it in terms of your massive credentials?
Well, I just wanted to go down memory lane with you, Scott, for a minute, because you mentioned the Clippers in 84. And I'm wondering if you remember this.
Oh my God, yes.
The team schedule. This was the first. Look, it's printed on here as a poster. This was the first LA Clippers home schedule. You remember that?
Yes, I do. Bill Walton, Norm Nixon, and Marcus Johnson, for those you don't know. But wow, what memories.
Yeah,
that was 84.
84. I can go one better with you. How about this one? Look, I pulled this one out of the archive.
Where was that? That was on the beach in Santa Monica.
On the beach. On the beach. Can you believe this? This Lancaster Gordon, Bill Walton, Marcus Johnson, Norm Nixon with the Walkman. Got a Walkman. And Junior Bridgman. I mean, first of all, could you imagine ever trying to do this again with like LeBron and AD? And it's like, forget it. Anyway, I thought you'd get a kick out of seeing those.
Well, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, Andy, but you did a number of different fun shoots like that. I remember seeing one recently you put on social media, I think, the Lakers on the yacht. Whatever year that might have been, 80s.
Yeah, that was that was after I think it was either 87 or 88. It's one of those championship years. And our good buddy Lon Rosen had a fantastic idea. He goes, Andy, tomorrow we're going to get the whole team to go over to the Body Glove yacht, right? Because his buddy owned Body Glove, right? And we're going to just do a team picture over there somehow. And I said, okay. I don't know what that means. Right. So I show up, and it was the most unworkable situation you can possibly imagine. This beautiful boat was tied to the dock with boats on either side. There was no way to set up anything, lighting, camera, tripod. I was doing like a Wallenda act, between two boats. And then Lon had the additional brilliant idea of like giving the guys props, like they were fishing or like it was a nautical theme. Right. And it's the most hilarious picture ever. And it has had a new life with my new platform, Legends of Sport. But people love that. Jeannie actually commented on that poster. I think the Lakers posted it during the bubble for some unknown reason. I don't know why, but she commented on it. It was pretty cool.
Those of you listening or watching, Jeannie being Jeannie Buss, the I guess, co-owner, but
Yeah.
clearly the lead owner when
Yeah.
they were siblings.
Mhm.
After her father, Jerry Butts, had unfortunately passed away. But
Mhm.
Jeannie, we all have many, many memories, which leads me, and we can go on forever, and I'm absolutely looking forward to this so much. But I mean, you've been shooting for 40 years. You've done probably every major event that, anybody can ever think about. But is there, probably unfair to ask you if there's one moment, but are there a couple moments that stand out in your 40 years that say, man, I look back and, these were the pinnacle of what I've done? I mean, I know you were around the dream team in 1992 in Barcelona, which was,
Yeah.
the major change and shift to the Olympic Games and that team. But what are some of your favorite moments or moment?
I'm glad you brought up the dream team, because that was literally the dream assignment, for a photographer. 7 weeks I was embedded with the team from the first day of training camp, which was in San Diego, and then they went to the Tournament of the Americas in Portland. Then we went to Monte Carlo for quote unquote training camp.
Wow.
And then Barcelona. And I was the only photographer embedded with them the entire time. My good friend Nat Butler joined me along the way. And together we documented this historic moment in sports and NBA history, Olympic history. That was pretty amazing. And if you look at a career, being able to be around Magic's entire career from day one.
Right.
Well, actually, I came in Magic's second season officially, but I did shoot in his rookie year as a student. But then to document his entire career, and then of course to document Kobe's 20-year career,
Right.
from literally beginning to end, first picture to last picture.
Wow. Wow.
So it's been a good run. I was around for the whole Last Dance. It was a real thrill watching the Last Dance Bulls documentary. I kept seeing myself, with the mustache and the big Jufro hair, you remember me like that.
Yeah.
And all my buddies who were documenting that for NBA Entertainment, and, being there for all 6 championships, and even before. I mean, it was truly, it was very nostalgic, but it was very gratifying to know that, I was put in that position by the NBA and able to document that. And, the beat goes on. I mean, this bubble experience I just had, I was in the bubble for 7 weeks, 53 days. I don't think, God willing, we'll ever see that again. So that was pretty historic.
Let's come back to that. But I want to ask you, because again, we could go on forever, but I want to ask you about Kobe. And I know you collaborated with Kobe on a book that is been much talked about, The Mamba Mentality. Talk a little bit about that collaboration. I mean, again, you mentioned you shot Kobe from his first to his unfortunate passing in his last, but share a little bit about that book and about the relationship you have with Kobe, and I know equally is with his family.
Yeah, it was kind of meant to be, I think, from the beginning. Kobe and I met 96. He was a rookie. He just turned 18 years old. He was 17 when he was drafted, and he turned 18 before Media Day. And I met him on that Media Day in 96 in, I believe it was Loyola Marymount gym, where the Lakers
alma mater.
Yeah, there you go. Where they used to have their, their practices and stuff.
Yeah.
And by that time, I'd been in the league. I'd worked for the Lakers. I'd shot all of Showtime. I'd been exposed to Magic and Pat Riley and Jerry West and the Buss family. And I had built a lot of trust, I think. And I had built, somewhat of a reputation. And anyway, so I go in to meet him. And you probably heard this story, but I'll tell it anyway. So I go in to meet him on my set. He comes over to my set. I'm going to take his headshot for the first time as a Laker. And I say, "Hey, Kobe, I'm Andy Bernstein. I'm your team photographer." I put my hand out, and he grabs my hand, looks me straight in the eyes. "Well, I know who you are." And I said, and I'm thinking, okay, this is a smart ass kid who's like, how do you possibly know who I am? We never met. I told him that. He says, "Well, I know you because I had all your posters in my room growing up."
Wow.
And I'm thinking to myself, Scott, this is unbelievable that this guy has studied every inch of a poster. And you've seen a million sports posters. Do you know where the photo credit is? It's like printed like in the
very bottom,
very bottom in microscopic almost type. The only people who look at those are fellow photographers, because we're all jealous of who got which poster. And it just struck me that here was a kid that was so driven and so determined.
Wow.
That he would read a credit. And I'm 20 years older than him. I'm thinking, wow, I kind of see a little bit of myself in him at 18. Like, I remember how driven I was, a little bit of an edge, a chip on my shoulder. You kind of remember the old me, Scott. A little aggressive, can't take no for an answer.
In a good way, Andy, in a good way, right?
Well,
I never can have a bad experience with you, ever.
Well,
You're a good friend, but
I appreciate that. Can I print that on a T-shirt? But point being is that we just bonded, and I saw how close he was with his family, especially with his dad at the time, and he lived with his parents like his first 2 years.
Wow. Yeah.
And I admired him. I really did. And I could see how it was painful for him to be sitting on the bench, and Del Harris wouldn't play him, and then he chucked those 3 air balls during the playoffs against Utah, and any other player, especially somebody his age, they could have broken his spirit. Not Kobe. He came back. He said he shot 1 million shots that summer, which I don't doubt. And he came back stronger than ever in his second year. And that was the year, of course, really was his unveiling at the All-Star game. And, the rest is really history. And I was very fortunate, that the NBA put me in a position to be around him all the time. The Lakers accepted me into that inner circle, especially my good friend who you know very well, Gary Vitti, who really opened up the training room to me, which he didn't have to do because that was his domain. Mitch Kupchak was incredibly gracious and understood what I was trying to do. And so did Phil Jackson. I mean, Phil got it. I had known Phil from his Bulls days. So.
But building those relationships, Andy, is a credit to your personality. Again, I'm not trying to be overly gratuitous, but it's you, and you're very humble. But building that trust. I mean, a guy like Phil Jackson obviously won,
11
championships.
Yeah.
Gary Vitti, as you mentioned, was the longtime trainer for the Lakers. And I had interaction with Gary Young in my career. And Gary's a great guy, but he was tough, right?
Oh, yeah.
Protective of his domain. And they're in situations where they're treating and caring for the players, and to have you in that environment is, again, it shows a lot of the trust in you as a person and how you treated that outside those confines.
Yeah, well, thank you. I have to go back to Pat Riley, honestly, and it is a story you probably never heard, Scott. But here I am, this young photographer, and I'm trying to make a mark for myself. There are other photographers out there, and everybody's good and they're producing good material, but I felt a little bit like my forte was being on the inside, was kind of getting behind the scenes, seeing what goes on behind the curtain, so to speak. And and when Pat became coach, I it was in my second, third year or whatever, I kept trying to get into his huddle. And, there'd be a timeout or before the game when he would be talking to the players, or when they gathered the team after halftime or whatever. And every time I'd come in, he would see me. Like, he'd be in the clipboard, but he would see me and he would point at me, and he would use very specific language from Schenectady, where he grew up, which I understand because I'm a Brooklyn guy. And I just kept doing it. And finally, maybe 2 weeks later, I'm on the baseline getting ready for the game. The players were coming out for the game. He's getting himself ready with Bill Burtka, and, and he looks over and he sees me and he goes, "Come over here," like this. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to the principal's office. My career it's come to a screeching halt. And he looked me straight in the eye. He says, "Kid," he called me kid. He says, "Kid," he says, "why the hell you keep trying to get in my huddle?" And I said, "I keep getting you out." And I said, "Coach, you got to understand, people want to see you talking to Magic. They want to see you and Kareem. They see you and Burtka doing strategy. People want to get in there. Even TV wasn't really getting in the huddle. They were kind of from the outside." And he said, he said, "Okay, I get it." He said, "I'm going to let you do it once tonight, just once. And if you screw it up," he didn't say screw it up, but if you screw it up, you're never coming back." So meanwhile, fast forward, I do it. The next game was a couple of days later. I'd made a couple of prints, right? And I go into his office before the game. I give him the prints, and he looks up. He says, "You were in my huddle?" And I said, "Yes, Coach, I was in your huddle." He goes, okay, you did good.
Nice.
You could come back.
Nice.
So the reason I tell that story is that it built a lot of trust. It built a lot of self-confidence, right, in me. And, that was seen by people like Phil Jackson. I was the only photographer that Phil let into his locker room all 11 times. The first photographer in was always me. And there was a reason for that.
And I should know this, but the famous picture of Michael Jordan, I think his father had recently passed away. I don't know if you were around or if that was your picture.
Oh, yeah. That's my picture.
And for those of you who haven't, it's iconic, right? And I have a note here. I want to talk about iconic images, but that one, I think, with Michael hugging the trophy, I think he was laying on the floor, right? And his father had passed away that year at some point.
Yeah.
If you have access to the room, wow.
Yeah, you're talking about the picture from, I believe it was 96 or the second three-peat, I'm not sure. But there are two different pictures here. The one I think you were referring to was his first championship where he's hugging the trophy, crying his eyes out. His dad is next to him, sort of consoling him. That was in 91 at the Forum, in the old Forum visitors
dressing room.
Size
of a closet.
The worst. Absolutely unbelievable. Bedlam, chaos going on in that locker room. And some sixth sense, said, look over here, because they couldn't find Michael anywhere. TV was trying to get him live and all this stuff. And something said, just look to your left. I was standing on a bridge table. Remember, they used to put tables in the middle of the locker room so the guys could get their gum and leave the tickets there and all that, right?
Oh God, memories, yes.
And that's the only vantage point I could get, because literally chaos going on in this tiny little locker room. And on top of that, the network decided, let's do the trophy presentation live in the locker room. Yeah. So anyway, that's how that picture all happened.
Wow. Again, that's amazing. And point of reference, I was fortunate to work for the Lakers at a young age. In those rooms, I'm trying to think if I can give it a description, but
yeah.
Probably 10 feet, maybe this is an exaggeration, probably 15 feet wide by probably 50 feet long. Not a big room. And to have the post-game television in there with celebrations and champagne and chaos. Words alone can't describe that.
Yeah, it probably had like a 9-foot ceiling, and the network built a little stage in the corner with TV cameras and cables and lighting and by that point everybody had come in. They got families in there. You got all the players. Champagne is flying all over the place. It was insanity. Thank God they don't do that anymore. But if anybody can appreciate it, it's you, because you know the Forum backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
In my mind's eye now, I'm remembering those crazy tiny. The Kings locker room was probably the size of like a glorified men's room, right? And that was the home team's locker room. It was crazy. Yeah.
It's crazy. And how things have changed, right? The locker rooms now and the palaces now are unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly.
I go back to the iconic shots, Andy, and I think there's one that I see everywhere. And I think I saw it when I was doing some research just to make sure I didn't forget anything here. And it's the famous shot that I think is seen everywhere with, I think, Bird's leaning into Magic or Magic leaning into Bird. And that was the amazing rivalries of the 80s. The Celtics winning them, the Lakers winning them. What year was that from? And that got a ton of exposure. Right?
Yeah, that's, you can't see it here, but it's hanging right off to the left here. A huge print of it because it ended up being the cover of Sports Illustrated. That was the 87 finals. And it was very interesting, Scott, because as you and a lot of sports fans who are listening or watching this know, that Bird and Magic, although they were the two greatest players and the two best players on their teams, they never really guarded each other. They would play different positions. The way it was set up back in those days, it wasn't a lot of what we call switching going on, where guards would guard forwards or forwards would guard guards. Sometimes that would happen, if a guy got picked or something. So the only times I could really get Bird and Magic in the same frame together was the captain's meeting at 5 minutes before the game, when they come out at center court and they meet with the refs and they shake hands and you have a moment there, right? Or when they were lining up during a free throw, right? And some other guys shooting a free throw, they would line up, and you got to pray that they're going to line up on the side that's facing you, first of all, because they could have their backs too, And that particular shot, as well as another one that I shot in Boston Garden that was sort of similar, that was that situation. It's just a free throw situation. But what's really interesting about that picture is that neither guy is dominant over the other. They're sort of intertwined. And David Stern actually said that picture helped define the era because it really was the Lakers against the Celtics. Yeah, he did.
That's flattering.
Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah, it really was. I mean, for your boss to say that's first of all, that's really humbling, but it also kind of throws the gauntlet down like, okay, now what do you got?
Exactly. Well, you did a lot since then. And there's a million shots, Andy. But another one that I recently saw that I wrote down is one to ask you about. There's a phenomenal shot. I think it might have been a season or two ago. Well, it must have been no more than two ago. It wasn't last year, maybe because of COVID, and we'll get to the bubble in a minute. But of LeBron coming in, you've got this wide angle shot coming back. I mean, from the floor where you sit, and LeBron's coming in with the scoreboard. What an amazing shot. And that too, I think, was an SI or.
Yeah, that's hanging right here on top. I put my favorite stuff up so I can remember that I actually shot it. That was really profound in terms of the timing more than anything, and the timing of when it was shot. It was right after the tragedy with Kobe. And I think it was 10 days later we had a game, and it's against Houston. And I'm looking at it right now. And I do all these remote cameras, which are these stationary cameras that are put in strategic spots all around the court and the arena. And this particular camera is a spot that I invented, quite frankly, where we cut a hole. There's stories behind all this stuff, and people that like I talked Lee Zeidman. Believe this, if anybody in the world could believe this, is you. Yeah. I talked Lee Zeidman into letting me cut a hole in the bottom of the basket stanchion, where there's a pad at the and because I wanted to insert a camera in the hole so that I would get this incredible symmetrical perspective, like a super wide angle perspective. He thought I was nuts, but Lee being Lee, he also said, yeah, that sounds actually pretty cool. Let me see what you can do. So he let me do it. And got to the point where the NBA then started to design their stanchions around that hole. This is true. So every arena now where you go, you have two of these holes, one on each side, for this, what we call the floor camera, because it's an amazing perspective.
Oh, it's a great shot.
Yeah. So I, lucky enough, my remotes are on the other side from where I shoot. So I'm actually in the picture on the other baseline. Okay. And I have to time it right, and I timed it correctly, and it got.
Well, I don't want to say, but I want to ask logistically. Maybe there's some minutia, but how do you control those remotes? You say you got 6 cameras. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to. Is you just punching some buttons?
Well, we at the NBA back in the I guess it was the early '90s. It was during the Jordan era. We were able to, back then, to only do one remote camera because I don't want to get too technical, but you remember putting strobes. I used to put strobes, these gigantic flash units in the ceilings of or the catwalks of the Forum and other arenas. Well, the strobes have to fire, but they only fire one time. And back in the day, you could only have one remote camera set up, that it would either you choose to shoot with the remote camera or you shoot with the camera in your hand, one or the other.
Because of the strobe.
Because of the strobes, right. And they have to what's called synchronize. They have to sync. So the shutter, the camera opening its shutter and exposing film in those days, and the strobes going off have to be in sync. And that's a millionth of a second. All that has to happen. And think about how vast an arena is. So back in the day, we used to have to hardwire. We used to run hundreds and hundreds of feet of wire, right? From my shooting position all the way to the other side of the court or up in the catwalk or wherever this one remote happened to be. Well, we were approached by these egghead engineers, these guys that knew nothing about sports, but they designed this incredible radio-controlled synchronization method of being able to synchronize multiple cameras, almost an infinite number of cameras, with the one strobe burst. That I don't know how they did it, and the reason they did it was actually for laboratory use. So if they were shooting, whatever it could be like droplets or vaccines or whatever they're shooting, chemicals. And they came to us thinking that there was an application in sports, which there was, but it took 2 years to R&D this thing. We almost all killed each other, and we're trying to figure this out during an NBA finals, as I remember. It was crazy, crazy stuff. But finally, they perfected it. So now it's all radio controlled. So we have these sort of transceiver brains that are attached to each remote camera. And then there's a master brain that sends the signal to all of those brains, all of those remotes, that when I push an auxiliary button that's attached to my camera, it's just a little plunger button. It sends from the main brain to all the other ones go off. And that happens literally in a millionth of a second by radio. I mean, look, if we can get signals to the space station and Mars and everywhere else, we can do this. But to me, it was pretty amazing technology,
Wow. That's amazing.
So now we can do an infinite number, and that happens to be one of the angles that I do.
That's amazing. So go back for a minute. You talked about relationships. You talked about Pat Riley, and you talked about building that and with Jeannie Buss, et cetera. Lee Zeidman, and for those of you who don't know Lee, I've known Lee. Angie's known Lee since the days of the old Inglewood Forum, which is still there across the street from the magnificent new SoFi Stadium. And Lee Zeidman was at the time in operations, but now over at Staples, of course, and running Staples as the president. But Lee is a wonderful guy, but tough.
Yeah.
So for you to convince him, and I know you're official photographer of the Lakers and Kings and the Staples Center, but nonetheless, for you to go to him and say, I got this idea, crazy idea. I want to cut a hole in the bottom of the stanchion of the basket. I want the exclusive opportunity to lay the camera in there. I'm sure Lee's first answer was, pretty colorful.
Yeah.
But it's the relationship, and you're going back to what you've been able to achieve for 40 years that allowed that. And that's the difference maker.
Well, as you know, Lee is got his gruff side, but Lee is an innovative guy, and Lee loves to listen to new ideas. Anything that's going to enhance the fan experience, anything that's going to enhance his arena, something new and different. I mean, he and I have had many conversations over the years about, even with hockey and where we could put cameras or how we can shoot things differently. When the Kings were on the Stanley Cup run, Lee is always approachable. I mean, he's the president of a major entertainment complex. He's got a lot on his plate, but I love the guy to death. I really do. He's the kind of guy who you go toe to toe with, and then you'll just go into the club and have a beer with him.
He's a great guy, and he's done. He is where he is today because of his intellect and ingenuity and toughness. And good for him. Yeah. Good
and he's a great manager, by the way. You're on your toes with Lee all the time, and that could be detrimental as somebody who works for him, or you could take that as a challenge that he's continually challenging you and raising the bar. And I know, you've been in this business a long time, Scott. You know that nothing happens when things stay stagnant. You have to continually and you try things, some things don't work, and you learn from that. So,
well, we worked with Lee, I guess a year or so ago, on a replacement of a longtime employee of his that did all the booking and left. But and again, known Lee for a number of years. But to your point, he's tough, but he's very, very fair. And the loyalty of, and it goes both ways, right? You can't demand loyalty and not give loyalty back. But the tenure of people that have worked for Lee for years. I mean, when he engaged us to do the search and the replacement, he goes, I haven't really hired anybody of this magnitude in years because no one leaves.
Right.
So Lee can be tough, but he's extremely fair. And a great guy to work for, to your point. So
well, David Stern was like that too. When I started with the NBA, it was a tiny little infant company. NBA Entertainment didn't exist. NBA Properties had 4 people working for 4.
Wow.
In the league office. There was 2 offices. It was ridiculous.
That was what, 82, 83 in that range?
That was, pretty much. 83 was my first real gig with the NBA, which is the 83 All-Star Game at the Forum, which you were probably at, I would think. You were probably there. But David, back in the day, we would call him Uncle David. I mean, it was really like a little family that we had. And then it became this gigantic conglomerate worldwide company. But he managed, tough, and he challenged, and he didn't have the greatest patience in the world, but he also wanted to make the most of the people he had, because he knew that if he pushed even further, that that you had it in you. You know, it's almost like the Mamba mentality before Kobe created it, you know. And I respected that from David. I always did. I always knew that that he had his antenna up all the time, and he knew everything that was going on, and he would call you on it. You know, I mean, luckily I never had like a run-in with him, but I knew people who did, who actually came out better for it because it
Well, I was
just
just going to
pushed
say,
them.
Andy, there's, and I've been fortunate to be in business for a long time, and it's not indigenous to sport. I think it's indigenous to senior management. But
Mhm.
I worked for somebody in my career where if you didn't push back,
Mm.
then you know they say, well, this person doesn't have the strength and the character to be a leader for me. So I've heard stories about David, and I think to your point, whether it's you or his other executives or anybody else that pushed back and didn't necessarily take the gruffness and said, well, wait a minute. I
Mhm.
think it garners so much more respect from the other side, from a David Stern. Gary Bettman was like, Gary was a
Yeah.
terrific guy who wanted to work for.
Mhm.
Tremendous respect for Gary, but he challenged you. And if you
Yeah.
didn't stand up to the challenge,
Yeah.
you know, you may not have, you know, advanced on, because I think leaders are looking for that. They're not
Yeah.
looking for yes men or yes women. They're
Mhm.
looking for challengers. And so to your point,
Yeah.
I'm sure David was like that.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, Scott, you've probably been, and I've definitely been around people I've had to work for that didn't have that self-confidence, that didn't believe in themselves, right? That didn't
Right.
believe that they even belonged in that position of
Yeah.
authority
Yeah.
and management, and that would come through with them being bullies and aggressive because I guess they were just trying to justify it. And
Right.
that's a recipe for disaster, because in business, you can't get anything done that way. You can't be
Right.
continually putting your people on their heels
Right.
and not being able to back that up with your own, I guess, confidence and your own willingness to take risks. And then if the risks fail, you learn from them and you move forward, or you circle the wagons and you do something else.
Right.
But unfortunately, I've had to work for a couple of people like that along the way, and those people have fallen off to the wayside,
Yeah.
quite frankly. And guys like you and I are still doing what we do, so there's a reason for that.
Well, I think it's simple. You got to take care. You got to treat people nice, and it comes back
Yeah.
back around.
Mm-hmm.
What? Let's talk about the bubble. And
Mm-hmm.
you alluded to it. I mean, God forbid we ever have to live through that again. Although
Yeah.
clearly, as we sit here at the end of the 2020, November and December,
Mm-hmm.
we're still not sure when we're going to have arenas and stadiums full of fans. But
Yeah.
talk about that experience. That must have been, you know, and I know you went down a little bit into there, then got there in time perhaps for the playoffs. But
Mm-hmm.
describe a little bit of that experience and the nuance of it. The nuance is too
Yeah.
simple of a word.
Well, it was crazy. March 11th, everything shut down. 100% of my work went away on March 11th. So March 10th, we were doing great. I had 3 teams going on. Lakers, Clippers, and Kings are playing a full schedule in Staples Center. We had 2 G League teams going on. We had events going on in Staples Center and Microsoft Theater. Sometimes we'd have 3-4 events a day that we were responsible for shooting all over town. And then March 11th, boom, everything shut down. So that was a shock. I was able to get the PPP loan, which was very helpful for keeping the business afloat for a couple of months. And then unfortunately, I had to lay people off because we just had no work. So by the time the NBA came up with the bubble idea, I was ready to go back to work. I needed to work. I needed to earn. I was getting a little, even though I was doing a lot of work with my other business, my Legends of Sport business, I was, I needed to work. So my boss at the NBA presented the scenario of 3 different waves of photographers to go down over basically the 3.5 months. The beginning with the setup and the initial, games and mini training camp and games, and then the middle portion, and then basically conference finals and finals, which really is what he
The 3
preferred.
different ways because of a capacity or lack of capacity side?
Well, because we were very limited to how many photographers could be there. It was agreed that only 3 or 4 would really be allowed in the bubble. It was very, very expensive for the NBA to have staff, have people there, and they needed to keep just keep the personnel to a minimum, quite frankly. So we weren't allowed to bring assistants. We were just by ourselves. So I chose the third portion, which I think is what he had preferred me to do anyway. And my good friend and cohort, Nat Butler, came down with me at that point. There were two other photographers there who had been there from the beginning. I mean, these guys were, at the end, had been there like 110 days,
Wow.
which is, crazy.
Wow. Yeah.
So the four of us just split up the conference finals and covered the finals together. And that was 53 days. But it was much different, obviously, than any other coverage I've ever done, with no photographers on the court.
I was gonna say, you weren't sitting on the floor. I mean, your coach for 40 years had been sitting on the baseline.
Yeah, it was tough.
Now so were you up on the side in the stands? Were you on the end zone, or?
Yeah, they put us in the corners. So if you were looking at the TV screen, we were sort of the bottom left, bottom right, like sort of out of shot, but where the TV / cameras are in the corners, basically. Okay. And so they put advertising signage around the entire court. Mm-hmm. And the floor of the court was completely clean. No videographers, no photographers. And we were off to the side. And then there was one more position, which was somewhat elevated around center court. And the arena was basically a set that they had built. The NBA had built inside another arena. It wasn't a real court. It was a fake, kind of not fake, but it was a made for TV situation with the video boards and the virtual fans, the piped in music. And they tried their best to make it seem as realistic as possible. How
did it sound, Andy, in the building?
It sounded somewhat realistic because they piped in cheering and there was crescendos of crowd cheering and of course they had the PA announcers. They had different PA announcers who had their own style and stuff. And you'd look up and you'd see fans, but they were virtual fans on a video board.
Did they pipe in any boom? I mean, that's controversial, but if there was a controversial call, to say the least, would they pipe in any, jeering or any bullying? Imagine that would not be advantageous.
But what was interesting is that you really could hear the conversations on the court where you normally couldn't. So you would hear the coaches yelling. The funniest thing, and I love this guy to death, Mike D'Antoni is a great friend of mine, right? And Mike, older gentleman, right? And there was concern about him and Greg Popovich and some of the older coaches even going to the bubble. Right. So I guess those guys had to just absolutely guarantee that they would keep their masks on all the time, right? So some of the coaches didn't do that, the younger coaches, but some of them, the older guys did, right? Yeah. And Mike would get so animated and yelling and screaming, he just ripped the mask off and so that the ref could actually see what he had to say, and then put the mask back on. So it was kind of comical at times, but I honestly felt like I was a little bit inside a video game because you
like a studio, right? It was almost like a Hollywood studio, I imagine.
Yeah. And there were literally no fans. There was nobody watching. By the time we got to the conference finals and finals, they allowed families to come, but it was, I think at the final game, there might have been 30 people there, literally. So, and then there was a second. No, I was going to say there was a second tier. So the second tier we were in what was called the green level. The second tier was considered yellow, and the two couldn't mix because we had went through full quarantine, full protocol. The yellow could come and go, but there was plexiglass in front of the yellow section, and that's where the owners would be. So Steve Ballmer, Jeannie Buss, all the owners were up there. And, you'd look up and you'd see them, you'd wave, Pat Riley, I'd wave to him, but there was no interaction. It was so bizarre.
Wow. What was the biggest challenge there? I mean, you lived there, what you said, 53 days?
53 days, yeah.
Hotel, sterile environment, and again, some of the players were there 3.5 months, but what was the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge for me was like a psychological challenge. I mean, it really was. I mean, I didn't realize it was going to be this profound, but you're in a confined situation. I mean, you cannot leave. I've never been in that. Like, even when you go to college, and you're a freshman and you're in your dorm, that like there's the outside world. You could walk into town or you could like go home if you wanted to on the bus or whatever it was. Yeah. And even, I mean, I equate it kind of to like when I went to summer camp, sleepaway camp when I was 11 years old, and, the bus drops you off and then you're like stuck in this place that you can't leave, but you could leave if you really wanted to. When
Yeah.
we were in the bubble, if you left, you were done. You were out. You could never come back. So that was weird. That was tough because the outside world is, and we were in Disney, which was also kind of, surreal.
Yeah, see, that's the
Yeah.
well, I mean, it's a
Yeah.
different word, but
No, it's
happiest place on earth, and you're stuck inside it, right?
right. And think about it, Scott. I mean, they opened Disney World, so families are going to Disney World, like, and we could see the park from our hotel, basically, from the tower of the hotel, you could see it, the Magic Kingdom.
Yeah.
So you're thinking that there's families out there doing that. We're in the middle of Florida during the absolute spike of the pandemic, right? I mean, COVID is absolutely going bananas in Central Florida at that point.
Right.
And the whole thing just didn't add up. It just did. And here we are, I felt 100% safe there, quite frankly, from COVID because of the testing. We had to do testing twice a day.
Wow.
Every day. We had to test ourselves when we first woke up, and then we had to go down the hall and get physically tested with nasal and throat swabs and wait for those results to come in. And we knew that the Disney employees were getting tested. And that was the biggest challenge, honestly. Being away from home, I looked at it as a very long road trip.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, the hotel was nice, but the rooms were small. You're in the middle of Florida. It was about 97% humidity and heat every day.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the most picturesque situation, but I was there to work. At one point I did 16 games in a row. I had 2 days off in the 53 days I was there.
Wow.
And, but I took it as a challenge and kind of gave me the opportunity to do things with Legends of Sport. I think I did 5 podcasts from my little hotel room, from the bubble, that we actually put out. So we had just partnered with the LA Times at that point. So we started a whole program of 16 weeks exploring the nuances of the bubble in the WNBA and the NBA side.
That's a good segue, because I want to talk about that. That's become another business of yours, Andy.
Mm-hmm.
Extremely successful. And there's one episode I'll talk to you in a minute that really, really resonated with me. But talk about Legend of Sport, the project. Your LA Times now, they're backing in involvement. Explain a little bit what it is and what drove you to do that.
Well, great question, Scott. I know you have friends who've been in the sports business for a long time, just as I do. And a couple of these friends and I happened to be at the MLB All-Star game. This is probably 12 years ago or something. We were in Arizona, just enjoying the weekend. One of my friends had like full access and was able to get us in. And I don't know about you, but guys our age don't really ever sit around, having a beer and say, oh, where do you think you're going to be 10 years from now? My wife and her friends, they do it all the time. Women are great at that. And I don't mean to be sexist, but like guys don't really do that in my experience. Guys are talking about whatever, their families, their business, what's going on. But we did this sort of exercise in like introspection and where would you like to be 10 years from now? What do you want to do? And the three of us, quite honestly, came up with the same answer, that we want to work together, the three of us. We want to do something in sports. We don't want to work for anybody. And we want to do something that's going to give back. I mean, like almost together in unison, we said those things.
Wow.
And so we thought about it a lot, and how are we going to do that? And what I had experienced, and my friends, and what you've seen who've been around a lot, is a lot of these retired athletes, especially in basketball, which is the one I'm closest to, but in other sports, some of them have fallen on really hard times. Some of them have had really tremendous difficulty post-retirement because they weren't prepared for it. They weren't educated about what was going to happen. They weren't set up financially. So the Magic Johnsons, the Shaqs of the world are very few and far between.
Sure.
And they've seen some real horror shows, as you have. And we don't have to name names, but we could, tick them off. And it's just so tragic. And I remember going to All-Star weekends, and they'd be bringing out these amazing legends, guys who Hall of Famers who people didn't even know who they were. I remember going to China went to China many, many times, and they bring legends, and the fans had no idea. They didn't know who Dr. J was. They didn't know, I mean, it was just a shame. So we found that the niche was probably going to be with retired athletes and legends. And so we named the company Legends of Sport, and we wanted it to be sport, all encompassing, worldwide. And we kept sort of kicking the idea around, and I kept getting some great feedback from mentors, people I respected in the business, people like Peter Guber. I went to Kobe about it, and Kobe was very helpful. But he said, Andy, what you're trying to do is really great. Trying to help athletes, you're trying to, do something very altruistic, but there has to be a business behind it. There has to be a revenue producing engine that's going to fuel that, right?
Kobe, I mean, what a brilliant.
Yeah. And he said, look, that all will come as a result of being successful in business, making a business out of it. So essentially we're going to create a foundation based on what the business can do, not the other way around, which is kind of honestly how we were thinking. And he helped me kind of pencil that out, and, wow. So we decided to lead off with a podcast, and this speaks to somebody else, Norm Pattis, a great friend who owned Westwood One Radio, incredibly successful, had just sold Westwood One, and instead of going off into retirement, he decided to strike lightning in a bottle again and started Podcast One. He was so successful with the radio business, he decided to do it in podcasting. And he had been watching this show that I do on the Laker Network called Through the Lens, where I sit with a Laker personality. I talk to them about their career through my photos. He said, Andy, we got to bring that show to my podcast network. At a game, at some game, pre-game, he brings me over. I said, well, Norm, that's great. I love it. But, this is a visual. It's like we're showing pictures. You've got a podcast network, which to my knowledge is really audio. He said, well, we'll figure something out. So I came, we had a couple of lunches, and we came up with the podcast, Legends of Sport, which is essentially the same idea where I sit with a personality in sports, and we talk about their career, and we talk about where they came from. And I found very quickly, Scott, that I had an affinity to doing this. I enjoyed talking to people. Everybody has a story. Everybody had a beginning. Everybody had somebody or a group of people that pushed them. That's a thread that goes through every iconic person in sports. Peter Guber, I love talking about this story where, Peter is one of the greatest owners in sports, right? He owns Warriors. He owns the Dodgers. He built 3 buildings at the same time, in California owns LAFC, the soccer team. Yeah. But Peter talks about how growing up in Boston, that he was a Red Sox fan, was so broke as a kid that he couldn't even afford a bleacher ticket at Fenway Park. He'd have to stand outside in Yawkey Way listening to the game going on, right, with the cheers, and hope that a home run ball came over the green monster. That was like his introduction to sports, and look where he is now. So I respect that. I respect people's stories. And I think we're trying to do good here. We're doing social justice issues. We're talking about mental health issues. A lot of the social justice conversation that was started in the bubble really made an impact on me, and I took that opportunity while I was there to really learn what was going on, like really learn what Black Lives Matter means. It's humbling to think about. I've worked around African-American athletes my entire career, but I don't really understand their story. I don't understand the battle. I never had to have the talk that so many African-American dads have had to have with their teenage sons. Like, it's so foreign to me. Yeah, but one after the other kept talking to me and telling me about it. And just did a great episode with Deton Thomas, who's not a household name, but he leads the way right now in athlete and activism issues, and amazing guy.
Well, I wanted you to talk about where to find it, but on all your traditional podcast networks, so to speak. But you talk about the mental health aspect of it. And Andy, I've listened to many of your Legend of Sport podcasts, but one that struck me really, really close was your interview with Jerry West. I think it was in August, and clearly a Hall of Famer. The logo, as he's often referred to, or the NBA is
Yeah.
referred to. But Jerry talked very candidly, and I didn't, I was fortunate to work for the Lakers as a really young kid when Jerry was still playing, and that's for another time, another day. But
Mm-hmm.
and then knew him as a Laker executive, and of course the head coach, and then the general manager of the Lakers. But your interview with Jerry was, Andy, was amazing, and where you got Jerry to talk about his mental illness and his anxiety and his depression.
Mm-hmm.
It struck me, and congrats on that session alone.
Well, thank you, Scott. Yeah, look, I've known Jerry my whole career too. One of the very first real portrait shoots I had to do was with Jerry West in his office. And the NBA sent me in there, and you remember Mary Lou Liebich, who was his guardian, of of everything Jerry, his right hand. And I come up there with my lights and my camera, and she looks at me. She said, "You ready?" I was like sweating bullets, And I said, "I hope so." And she said, "Okay." It was almost like throwing me into the fire, because here's the great Jerry West. And honestly, Scott, he couldn't have been nicer, more accommodating. He didn't have a lot of time. Jerry never has a lot of time. He's always very, you have to be very expeditious with Jerry. But from that moment, there was just a great sort of, I don't know, meeting of the minds. And I saw him as a person rather than somebody who's very intimidating. And I was around him a lot. Did his camp with Magic in Maui, and of course, all the great Laker memories that we have together. But Jerry was very, very open in his book that he wrote in 2009, co-authored by this amazing author, Jonathan Coleman, about how his life, he's had a very tormented life. And we all know, Jerry was sort of a nervous guy, and that he could never watch games from his seat, and he was always pacing around and
always stood in the tunnel by the Forum Club.
Yeah, but and there's legendary stories that he couldn't even watch like an entire finals game, that he just had to leave and drive around and listen to it on the radio. The game is going on at the Forum. And there was much unsaid about Jerry's life that he finally put out in his book. And he talked about some trauma that he had as a child, his difficult relationship with his father. His brother died in the Korean War. I think he was 20 years old, and Jerry, I think, was 14 or something. And how that has stayed with him his entire life. Wow. And his competitiveness beyond, normal competitiveness. I mean, it became an obsession. The fact that he had to endure losing to the Celtics 6 times in the finals, 6 times. As a player. Yeah. Unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
And kept coming back for more. Finally got the ring against the Knicks in 70, whatever year that was. And
72, that photo above my shoulder here.
Yeah.
From that year.
Right.
Found from 1972. Yeah.
Right. And got some vindication, at least as a player, but, didn't from beating the Celtics until the Lakers actually beat them in 85 when he was the GM.
Right.
And he calls that his greatest championship because, he was part of that. He was the architect. But Jerry, honestly, now at 82 years old, he's very willing to talk about his struggles, his battles, his demons. Jerry really led the way. I mean, I think it's safe to say in sports, he really led the way in laying it all out there. I mean, Kevin Love, God bless him, has gotten a lot of credit, and well-deserved credit for putting his battles out there with mental health. So many other players as well. But I think they need to really honor Jerry, because Jerry's book, he didn't have to write that book, and he didn't have to write that kind of book. He chose to do that. What's interesting, at the time, Scott, it really wasn't given the respect that it deserved. There were reviews about it. There were some articles, but mental health now being at the forefront of the athlete's experience in professional and amateur sports. I wonder if that book had come out now, at the impact that would make, especially with social media being where it is now.
and an icon like Jerry to tell the story, right? Which I
Yeah.
think you're right, the timing of it. 2008, I think you said in the book's West by West.
Yeah.
But which I have not read, but now will read. You and I were talking about before we started talking formally here, but
yeah.
And I don't want to keep you. We're almost an hour into this, and we could go on and on and on.
Oh, it's fun. I love it.
For years, but the podcast is Legends of Sport. It's on all the Spotify, and Apple, and all the other normal outlets. But what else should we know about Legends of Sport? Just in terms of what you got planned, or
Yeah, the podcast is actually co-produced and distributed by the LA Times. So if you're an LA Times reader online or at home, you can get the podcast on their app, which is great. But at the same time, you can also get it from Apple, Spotify, Anchor, all the other podcast networks. We release the podcast every other Tuesday, and it's released as an audio podcast and also a full video podcast. And that can be found on our YouTube channel, Legends of Sport. And we have, of course, social media, Instagram @Legends of Sport. And our TikTok channel is also Legends of Sport. And Twitter, which we've been doing a lot on Twitter these days, @Legends_of_Sport. And my photography, I continue to post things almost daily on my Instagram. It's ADB Photo Inc. Right. And what we have down the pipe is some events, some virtual events. We wish we could do, in-person events, but we're going to do some virtual events and involve legends. More to be revealed about that. And please, folks, just check our social media and listen to the podcast. But we have 3 or 4 events planned for the first quarter of next year. So keeping our fingers crossed that can happen. And other projects. We're working on something right now involving documenting the murals, all the murals that are going up all over the world honoring Kobe and Gigi. So we've partnered with a gentleman who has an incredible site, and I'm going to plug his site here, which is called kobemural.com, or on Instagram it's Kobe Mural. And this guy, Mike Asner, has tracked every mural throughout the world, of which there's probably 500 or 600 murals in places you wouldn't even believe. Wow. I mean, Pakistan, there's one in, there's multiple ones in Australia, China, every place in Europe. I mean, it's really, really mind-blowing, actually. And we've met many of the local muralists here in LA. In fact, I have a guy coming over today who, the building owner who owns the building where my office is, has very graciously and generously offered to put a Kobe mural on the outside wall of our building, which is amazing. So the muralist is going to come over today and kind of sketch all that out. So it's pretty cool. Pretty cool stuff.
And you're a champ, and I can humbly say you're the first Hall of Famer I've ever spoken to in this context, and so it's an honor as a Hall of Famer. But Andy's a dear friend and someone that I've known, like you and I said at the outset, from 1983 or 84. You've done amazing work. We didn't even get into Bruce Springsteen conversations about Freehold, because our office is in Freehold, and Andy's a passionate Bruce Springsteen fan and follower and friend. But thank you so much for your time, Andy. Appreciate and congrats on all your amazing success, your Hall of Fame career. And I look forward to speaking again, hopefully when we can get back into arenas and see you back doing your great craft.
Oh, absolutely, Scott. Thanks so much, man. It's so great, to stay in touch. We've stayed in touch over the years through Facebook and stuff, and I followed what you're doing with Prodigy, which is really, really incredible. And great to connect this way as well. I'm available anytime. Anytime you want to chat, you want to talk about Bruce, you want to talk about sports, talk about Lee Zeidman, I don't care. I love talking to you.
All right, my friend. You're a good friend. Best wishes. Stay healthy, you and your family, and have a happy holiday, sir.
You too, Scott. Thanks, pal. Thanks so much.